Okay, hello everybody. As many of you know, Gilat is a leading global provider of products and services for satellite-based broadband communications. Gilat is in this business for almost 30 years, and we specialize in fixed and on-the-move communications for both commercial and government entities. We have recently launched a revolutionary X architecture that is already being adopted by leading satellite operators around the world. In today's webinar, we will focus on the hottest topic in satellite communication, high throughput satellites, or often simply called HTS. We will discuss in this webinar the opportunities and challenges that are stemming from the abundance of additional capacity at a lower cost. We will see how the opportunities to provide additional bandwidth to an assortment of new applications requires both technical and business change. We will focus on the change that is required of the ground segment in order to maximize the HTS opportunity. I am very excited to present today's webinar, HTS Revolution is Here, or as subtitled, Are You Maximizing the HTS Opportunity? In this webinar today, I'm pleased to be hosting Jose del Rosario, Research Director, Manila, who is with Northern Sky Research, known also as NSR. NSR is a global market research company focusing on the analysis and growth in areas such as satellite communications. Before we get started with the webinar, please bear with me for a few procedural issues. If you would like to ask questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat box. We will take as many questions as time permits at the end of the presentation. But if there are questions that we don't get to during this session, don't be concerned because we will make sure to get back to you later. In case you missed something, also no worries, the webinar is being recorded and will be available on Gilat's website for further review soon after this webinar. Okay, let's now go over the agenda of today's webinar. Here now on slide 2, Mr. Jose del Rosario will start out with reviewing the geostationary HTS landscape, addressing the trends, challenges, and opportunities. He will show that HTS is a real game changer that must be taken into account. He then will explain its relevance to an assortment of vertical markets, and will discuss the HTS supply and demand for GEO satellites, showing the market dynamics, again emphasizing the important vertical markets. We will see clearly that the consumer broadband market is by far the largest in terms of bandwidth. However, higher margins can be reached from enterprise applications, as well as segments such as cellular backhaul and mobility. Particularly these days, very hot topic is the commercial in-flight sector. Mr. Del Rosario will end up with posing the question on what is required of the ground segment architecture in order to maximize these exciting opportunities. Then, before I go through the 5 key points, I will take a few minutes to explain in a nutshell the HTS challenge on the ground segment. I will then proceed to discuss what is required of the ground segment architecture to meet this challenge and what you should look for in your solution of choice in order to be best prepared for this HTS revolution. At the end, we will take some questions, and I'll finalize with a summary. So moving along, let's get started. I have the honor to present Jose del Rosario, NSR's Research Director. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Oren. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. On the next slide, we see the ecosystem that's developing for HTS, GeoHTS. This truly is a revolution, as Ms. Oren has pointed out, and it's a revolution because the game change, the swiftness, and the speed by which HTS has affected the market is truly fast. The revolution, however, is not done yet. We are now probably in the evolutionary stage. There are programs still to be launched. There are programs being announced. A lot of constellations, a lot of GeoHTS programs are being deployed, and these pose as challenges as well as opportunities. When we look at the left side of the screen, and this is how we see the landscape, basically the most obvious and most pronounced impact so far is intense competition that's being brought about by HTS, which has impact on customer ARPU levels as well as the return on investment in terms of programs in the sky and on the ground. This also will lead to exponential growth in terms of supply. We are no longer talking about megabits per second nor gigabits per second. We're already talking about terabytes per second of capacity. Regional HTS programs are reflected as well as global HTS programs that include the main players of Intelsat, Inmarsat, and others. Various standards on the ground are being vetted as well. Business cases and business models, both in closed and open systems, are also being talked about, and the value proposition is being vetted today. There is increasing price pressure, lower cost per bit due to the large supply coming in, and one of the challenges that need to be addressed currently and going forward well into 10, 15 years is the need for a unique value proposition in order to avoid commoditization at one point. This is not a complete landscape, and we note on the last dialog box on the right that there are others concerned. One of which we will talk about later is optimization and compression, and this has to do directly with ground systems. On the next slide, we then talk about the opportunity mix by market segment. On the top is the most obvious and the most targeted by GeoHTS programs, which is broadband access. This is a cost-driven segment. It's high volume, low margin. On the next enterprise vertical is the VSAT market, which is the complete opposite of broadband access. If broadband access is high volume, low margin, this is enterprise VSAT require very high SLAs that leads to high margins. Wireless backhaul is a subset of enterprise VSAT, but it's unique because it crosses over to consumer end users. On land-based towers, the need for better cost structures, which is already present in the space segment, needs to translate to the ground segment to justify return on investment. And then we've got mobility, which provide real growth opportunities today. We see that not only is HTS targeting this segment, but traditional FSS Ku-band capacity is being deployed on aircraft and maritime vessels such as cruise ships. This is the battleground application, and going forward, we believe that it's going to favor HTS because of the cost structure as outlined by Ms. Oren earlier. In all these market segments, our view at least is that the key to market success is lower cost structures for capital expenditures, operational cost, or what we call the total cost of ownership. Next slide, we look at the market trends for the wireless industry. The chart on the left is Ericsson's chart that tracks usage over the past 3 to 4 years. Year on year, first quarter 2013 and through third quarter of 2014, growth was at 60%. This is a hockey stick curve, but it's not a forecast. It's actual traffic of data networks. Voice traffic is consistent, so this has to be taken into account as well, because voice applications will not go away. The question of symmetry and bursty data have to be included in the mix, and once again, space systems can support this, but the ground systems have to close the loop. Ground systems or equipment have to be enabled in order to support both applications. On the right side of the screen is the forecast by Cisco. We are practically in 2016, and Cisco is seeing within the next 3 years that the dominant platform for traffic will be 4G traffic. 3G is already here, but by 2019, or 3 short years from now, it's going to account for a mere 30%. Traffic on 2G and 2.5 G networks will remain, and we note that this is not where the satellite industry needs to be today in terms of the wireless backhaul industry. Satellite networks are, for the most part today, as of the end of 2015, still throughputing 2G and 2.5G traffic. 3G is already being supported today, but going forward, we believe that for true value proposition to be enabled, the satellite industry needs to go to 4G. And this, in our view, is where the GEO HTS opportunity lies. Again, CapEx, OpEx, and total cost of ownership need to be improved dramatically in order to participate in the 4G networks. And when we go to 2020, people are already talking about 5G. So again, the revolution that HTS provides can truly address this. On the next slide, we then look at the application layer and compression as well as optimization on the ground. So we've already determined that on the space segment at least, there's a lot of capacity. There are different applications being targeted, but if you look at wireless backhaul once again, GEO HTS has the ability to provide high ROI savings via a multi-layer optimization and compression solution. The example we note here, and there are different products available in the marketplace, is the Gilat SkyEdge II-c. Of note is that all the components, encryption, GTP, acceleration, optimization, caching, there are solutions that are sold separately on this box, but the SkyEdge includes the solution that's embedded in the VSAT, so such that 3G LTE backhaul optimization and acceleration is done within the VSAT equipment, which leads to best quality of service and cost reduction. You don't have to buy a separate box to enable this capability. On the next slide, we then take a look at the addressable market for aero mobility. This is a really challenging market because commercial aircraft is traveling very fast and it covers a wide area. So you need beam switching when we talk about HTS. The addressable market is large already today. The main applications or the main platforms being applied are through wide-body aircraft. These are the 747, 767s that travel intercontinental or regional routes. And there are about 4,500 aircraft as of the end of 2014. We then look at the next level of demand, which is narrow body for national traffic or country-to-country traffic. And then we have business jets for high-paying customers with high disposable income levels that will take into account IFE and Wi-Fi services on board. There is also the larger pool of general aviation and rotor aircraft, which includes helicopters, etc. And this number is over 65,000. So the addressable market is large. Today, it's really restricted to wide body and then spilling over to narrow body aircraft. But when we look at the addressable market within a 20-year period, the chart on the right, when we look at the orders from Boeing and Airbus, Boeing has about over 31,000 aircraft already ordered. Customers will be buying these aircraft within this 20-year period. Its rival Airbus has a similar log, a little bit less, but just a little bit. They are approaching 31,000 aircraft as well. So combined, we're looking at 60,000 aircraft within a 20-year period that will require, when we look at the bottom of the screen, cockpit communications for safety and security, cabin and crew communications, internet access for passengers, entertainment, engine monitoring. We've heard a lot of challenges with the airline industry today, and the only platform that can track and provide M2M and SCADA services on aircraft are satellite solutions. So for us, at least, the HTS value proposition based on higher throughput will play a major role in the aeronautical connectivity market, as well as the security of the aircraft and tracking of aircraft over the long term. So on the next slide, we then take a look at the supply and demand and market dynamics of GEO HTS. So we start then on the next slide with the capacity. And capacity is not equal. The frequency mix is varied. We have C-band bandwidth supply coming in. Ku band bandwidth supply is already here. And Ka band is also here via VSAT in North America. KU band, Intelsat Epic NG will provide that. And here in Asia, where I'm based, IP Star is already here. C-band is a niche within a niche, I suppose, within the GEO HTS field. And again, when we look at satellite and we hear about rain attenuation issues, this is a value proposition that will also be compelling, leading to about 70 gigabits per second of traffic. So in terms of the frequency mix and the opportunities and the cost structure, what does this mean for the ground terminal equipment? Well, in our view, it really boils down to terminal equipment costs have to keep pace with lower space segment costs, but it's not that easy. When we're looking at different frequencies, antenna systems, serving different verticals and applications that have different service level agreements, it's not a solution that's readily available today. We have to buy different capabilities, different accessories, and different types of equipment and software in order to enable the SLA that the customers are requiring. So for HTS to truly impact the marketplace and get the benefits that are envisioned, ground equipment developments have to keep pace with space segment in terms of ensuring that quality of service and the cost savings have to be realized. So on the next slide then, we take a look at the demand and the revenue base. And Ms. Oren has already alluded to this earlier. GEO HTS bandwidth is expected to be dominated by broadband access. All other applications require relatively low bandwidth support. However, when we look at the revenue mix, it's a different story. When we look at the chart, the lower chart on the right, the market is more equalized. Again, broadband access is a high volume, low margin business, but when we look at other applications like mobility, enterprise data, and even to some extent wireless backhaul, these fetch higher margins. So again, the solution mix that's being offered on the ground to support different applications and different requirements, these have to be enabled differently, but if you have an integrated solution that can address all for simplicity, so much the better. So ground equipment has to address these differences, but in terms of, again, cost savings, simplicity, and seamless integration and application per vertical will be key. On the next slide, we then take a look at the bandwidth demand, and we see a rapid shift. Again, it's a revolution because the shifts and the changes are taking place very fast. In summary, though, we see that KU band usage will decline in favor of GEO HTS. HTS will grow at very robust levels. If you look at the chart on the right, TPE demand, traditional capacity on on KU band, will decline fairly rapidly starting in the 2018 timeframe. And by the time we get to GEO HTS, we're not talking about megabits or gigabits per second. We're talking about terabits per second of capacity within 2024 timeframe. The chart on the right also suggests, or we forecast, that because this is a revolution, GEO HTS will continue to address its traditional niche, which is rural and underserved areas. But because of the cost structure in space and on the ground, we believe that it opens up opportunities in non-traditional markets, which are the urban areas. To some extent, it's already happening in the North American markets with, Canada and the US with VSAT, and here in Asia, where I am based, we expect that to be replicated as well. So the game change is happening not just on the technical front, but also on the geographic coverage and new market opportunities opening up. On the next slide, we then look at enterprise VSAT. And again, there is a shift going on. It is revolutionary. It is quick. In summary, again, we believe that the shift will take place from narrowband systems to broadband systems, one-way to two-way services. And again, the best platform to address these market shifts depends on the space segment, but also, very importantly, on the ground segment. So opportunities abound for GEO HTS, but we shouldn't forget the challenges. And again, reliability, availability, high service level agreements will be key to the success of GEO HTS. So in summary, in 2014, our research shows that two-way broadband accounted for about 51% of enterprise VSAT. That will grow even more within a 10-year time frame, accounting for about 62%. Not to say that the other market segments will move away. There are niche applications for one-way narrowband, one-way broadband, and two-way narrowband, but over time, this market shift will move to two-way broadband systems. And again, because of the cost structures, it should move to HTS platforms. On the next slide, looking now at wireless backhaul, there is an emerging regional mix. Asia is dominating usage today. That will continue going forward. Other regions join in by 2021. And again, what is the best frequency mix? What is required of equipment manufacturers? We talked about C-band HTS platforms for Asia, and that might be required for rainy regions as well, including Latin America and to a certain extent parts of Africa. There is also a diversity of the customer base. Right now, it's Tier 1 telcos that can better provision services in rural and underserved areas, and also for accounting for universal service obligations. Emerging are Tier 2 telcos, and the goal is to leapfrog and compete aggressively with Tier 1 service providers, and also to address the shortfall of terrestrial infrastructure in key areas, not just in rural areas, but in some countries where development has not taken place. So again, what type of equipment will be the best fit for customer, whether it's Tier 1 or Tier 2, rainy region or not region? Again, the solution on the ground is very important to address that. On the next slide, looking at the mobility market, just very quickly here, again, wide-body aircraft is in terms of the penetration rate, is already high and will continue to be high over the forecast period of 2024. There will be OEM deals that will lead to a higher adoption rate. And when we look at the other aircraft, business jets will have a relatively slow ramp up, but we believe that the market will get there as well. The next slide talks about the maritime mobility. Again, oceans are large, so there is going to be a C-band play. KU band in terms of availability for cruise ships, and KA band as well, because you do have vessels and maritime units that are traversing only within 200 miles offshore. So the footprint can account for that. So it's a nascent market today. The maritime market is just beginning to take hold. The installed base may arguably be large, but the overall opportunity is very high. So on the next slide, we then see that given all these opportunities, all these trends, all these challenges that we have spoken about, what is the ground segment architecture required to maximize the HTS opportunity? There are answers being vetted out there. There are solutions being marketed already. But one solution coming from Gilat, we'll talk about the X architecture, and I'll come back later for your questions, and I thank you for listening. And I give it back to Ms. Oren.
Thank you, Mr. Del Rosario, for a most interesting market review. Please do stay with us until the end, because then we will take some questions from the attendees. So moving on to slide 18. In this part of the webinar, I will answer the question, what ground segment architecture is required in order to maximize the HTS opportunity? The short, quick answer is shown on this slide. You need a ground segment that will allow for high flexibility, high scalability, high density, high availability, high efficiency, low CapEx, of course, and low OpEx, all this while supporting multiple markets and operational scenarios. What does all this mean? How can we achieve it? To answer this question more in depth, let's take a brief look at the HTS challenge that is imposed on the ground segment. I'd like us to briefly go over the major technological change that is imposed by HTS on the ground segment to better understand what it is that we need to be offering. High throughput satellites work with multi-spot beams instead of using traditional wide beams. And the benefits are clear and are talked about a lot. They provide additional capacity, faster data rates, and all this, of course, at lower prices. However, this is changing the overall topology, including the space segment and ground segment architectures. The spot beams cover many small geographic areas. See the illustration. This is very different than the wide beam, which illuminates just one area. This is done by reusing frequencies in a method similar to that of cellular networks. So the spot beam satellites are able to provide much more capacity than standard wide beam satellites. But this advantage has implications on the ground segment architecture. To see how the expanded capacity of HTS impacts the ground segment equipment, I'd like to walk you through this example on slide 21. On the left, we see scenario A. Here we see a traditional wide beam satellite with a payload of 1 gigahertz, which is about 2 gigabits per second. It is comprised of a single wide beam. Notice the baseband equipment in one gateway that lights up the wide beam. On the other hand, on the right side, let's look at scenario B. Here we have a multi-spot beam scenario with a payload much higher of 10.5 gigahertz, or approximately 21 gigabits per second. In this example, we have 21 spot beams. Due to the multi-spot beam architecture, the gateway equipment is needed to support all 21 spot beams for the same coverage that I just mentioned with the wide beam in scenario A. So we need a minimum of 1 forward transmission carrier for each of the 21 beams on day 1 of the network deployment. Here in this example, in order to light up 21 beams, the baseband equipment is spread over, see here, 3 gateways, each with 7 beams lit up from each hub. You can clearly see that in order to support transmission in each of the spot beams, and that's important, in each of the spot beams, more baseband equipment is necessary than when just supporting a single transmission when using a wide beam. So obviously you see from this example that it is most important that the baseband equipment have high density and also be scalable. In addition, I want to also point out that it's not surprising that we see the low OpEx model of HTS suggest business changes in the value chain due to the required initial investment. So to summarize the impact of HTS, we see that HTS provides huge growth opportunities with its additional capacity. However, the topology is fundamentally different, changing both the business models and the ground segment architecture. The implications on the value chain and the shift of the satellite operators from selling megahertz to megabits per second is also suggesting new modes of operation for virtual network operators. And this business shift warrants really its own webinar that we will definitely schedule in the future. The focus in this webinar, however, is on the requirements of the ground segment and what it takes to maximize the HTS opportunity, what changes need to be done with the ground segment. So I have summarized here on this slide 23 the requirements on the ground segment with 5 key points that we believe must be carefully considered. First, the ground segment architecture. We believe it should be distributed and cloud-based. Second, I will explain why a single system ought to allow for multiple markets. And third, the third point that must be considered is the bandwidth management. This, of course, must be efficient for smart load balancing to guarantee the expected service plan. And the fourth point, the ground segment must allow for network scalability and flexibility to facilitate business growth, and elaborate on that soon. And last but not least, both the operating expenditure and the capital expenditure must be reduced. It is not sufficient, as was said before by Jose del Rosario, for the space segment costs to have come down. Also, the ground segment must do its share in both operational and capital expenditures. I want to now reiterate that Gilat just introduced a new X architecture for its SkyEdge II-c platform that answers these 5 key points. You will see in the following slides how we address each of these crucial points. Let's take them one at a time, starting with the need for a distributed cloud-based architecture. On slide 25, you see a diagram of the cloud-based distributed architecture. It allows for maximum network flexibility. See on the diagram this flexible architecture composed of 3 components. First, the baseband receive-transmit equipment, notice located in multiple gateways. Second, the cloud data processing units. Note that the architecture should be ready for next-generation software-defined networking and network function virtualization, also known as SDN NFV. And the third component is a centralized network management system. By the way, see in the diagram also a backup NMS and the backup NOC. Note that this distributed architecture allows for dynamic resource allocation across beams as well as among applications. See here an example of Gilat's baseband equipment. As I said, there should be flexibility to place this equipment in multiple gateways. The baseband chassis is the minimal equipment that is required in the gateway, and it allows to minimize, of course, the use of space and power. Gilat chassis that you see here, maybe it's a little hard to see, but it has 10 transmit cards and 20 receive cards. Gilat believes it is the most efficient chassis in the industry. On the next slide now, we see the data processing units or servers. This is the second component of the distributed architecture. These components are preferably located in a centralized cloud data center to gain operational efficiency. You see here in the picture Gilat's high-density scalable server. It has built-in support for SDN and performs functions such as acceleration and routing, QoS, and other management functions. Here too, the server location is flexible and can be chosen according to particular network design needs in order to best save OpEx. On slide 28, we see the third component of the distributed architecture, a centralized global NMS. This network needs to be remotely controllable by a single global network management system. It should enable full configuration, control, and monitoring of all the hub elements and remote terminals, no matter where they physically are located. And you can see here on the slide some screenshots from Gilat's Total NMS that meets exactly this requirement. I want to point out something else about Gilat's Total NMS. Its complexity, or rather the complexity of the HTS networks is simplified via this smart service-oriented NMS. What we do is we take care of the service level and not at the equipment level. And this is done in order to simplify the service provider's operations. And also it eliminates errors from being introduced. Let's now move on to the second point that will enable you to maximize the HTS potential. And this second point here is support for multiple markets. The architecture that is ideal to maximize the opportunity should enable expansion into new markets. In other words, one platform should be able to support multiple applications and business scenarios. And why is this important? This is because you want to be able to offset the expense of the initial investment that was mentioned earlier and to achieve a better total cost of ownership. Now, the goal traditionally was to utilize the large amount of bandwidth. But notice that as we heard earlier from NSR, it is not only about the fill ratio, but about improving the revenue per bit. We are seeing that HTS has opened opportunities for markets that have not been traditional markets for satellite communication. I would like to point out that there are two factors that have converged to bring new market opportunities now to the table. First is the abundance of capacity brought about by HTS. But two, not less important, is the growing need for data connectivity. And this is happening now throughout the world, in more parts of the world than before. So this convergence is really making this opportunity hot today. The ideal architecture, therefore, must support not only the fast-growing, high-volume consumer broadband market, but also the high-growth and the high-revenue markets, as mentioned before, as cellular, 3G, or particularly LTE backhauling, mobility, primarily airborne connectivity, and enterprise. Ideally, then, a single platform should provide support for service expansion to any fixed or mobility market. See here on the next slide that Gilat has recently introduced to the market a set of tailored VSATs. These VSATs have been optimized for the various market needs. This is very important, following up on Mr. Del Rosario's comment that the equipment also must be at a lower cost. It is very and at the right service level. So it is very important to have different VSATs to cater to the different needs of the different markets. And indeed, we have brought quite a set of VSATs to market. You can find more information about these VSATs on our website, which is www.gilat.com. Let's move on to the third point out of the 5 crucial points that need to be addressed in order for the ground segment, again, to maximize the HTS opportunity. And now we're going to be talking about efficient bandwidth management. The nature of multi-spot beams has implications, as we talked about, both for fixed and mobility applications. We need to take into account that the bandwidth is divided into many geographically separated beams. These beams, as you see here in the picture, are adjacent and actually even overlapping. So therefore, there are multiple choices for beam selection for a specific fixed service. So a smart bandwidth management enables to distribute the load among carriers and beams. And this is what will guarantee support of the expected service plans. This is indeed done with the X architecture. And for service continuity in mobility applications for land, sea, or air, automatic beam switching is required. In other words, when you travel through beams, you must make sure to have continuity of service. So notice here on the next slide showing an example of a commercial airline flying through beams. Automatic beam switching is a must to maintain this coverage while on the move. And indeed, this is supported by X architecture. The fourth point I would like to address is network scalability and flexibility. These are big words, but very important ones. It is essential for the architecture to easily and cost-effectively facilitate business growth, as I mentioned earlier. This network scalability should include both broader geographic coverage as well as increase in bandwidth. It should be easy to provide additional geographic coverage by adding support for more satellites in any frequency band, C, Ku, or Ka. See here on slide 38 concurrent support for the C-band wide beam satellite, as well as the multi-spot beam satellites that you can see here in Ka and Ku. The architecture must also allow to scale up capacity as needed to support additional users. Recall that due to the multi-spot beam architecture, all beams must be lit up on day one with initial minimal capacity. However, it should be easy to scale up as the business grows. So in this example, see that in-flight users and consumer broadband users are added within the beam. Now on slide 40, you can see how you can increase satellite bandwidth capacity by adding more beams. This should be easy to do by inserting transmit and receive cards in the chassis. So this scalability here is shown with the yellow and pink cards. For example, see the pink card for the pink beam and the yellow card for the yellow beam. Now, it would be even better to have an architecture that has a software-defined RF matrix that allows to do this remotely. Now, this can be done by having pre-embedded cards in the chassis, and I will explain this further in just a few minutes when I get to the next point, since it ties to the fifth point, which I'm about to talk about. And indeed, here we are, the fifth point. To ensure maximum opportunity, we need to have both the best OpEx and CapEx. And I would like to take you through a few such examples. The first example on slide 42 is I will give you an example of how SDN, software-defined networking, is already implemented in the X architecture. It enables fantastic operational cost saving via software. Recall before when I spoke about adding beams by inserting TX and RX cards with the yellow and pink cards? Well, Gilat's RF-defined metrics also allows to do this via remote operation, and this reduces the overhead of site visits. So this minimizes manual intervention in LAN and RF configuration, and not therefore only reducing costs, but it also shortens the activation time as well as improving on reliability. So let's look at this example on slide 42 to see here one chassis connected to 5 satellites, providing a certain amount of capacity on each satellite. You see here the range of the pink, green, orange, blue, and yellow, each one of them with a different amount of capacity in megabits per second. Let's focus on the Oren satellite, currently providing 200 megabits per second with one TX-RX carrier that you can see here in orange in the chassis. Now, see on the next slide, in order to increase capacity of the Oren satellite, you can remotely allocate 3 of the unallocated cards that were white before, with turning now orange to give more capacity to the Oren satellite. And this increases its capacity to, in this example, 409 megabits per second. This is pretty amazing, by the way, in terms of cost saving, and a very clear example of SDN implementation. Now, on the next slide, we can see another significant cost saving example, this time on capital expenditure. This had to do with the density of the equipment. See here a comparison of the density of other baseband equipment on the left, with X architecture ground segment equipment on the right. Careful design of the very dense X architecture chassis and servers saves on rack space and power. As a matter of fact, when compared to other solutions, we measure the X architecture to be about 4 times more dense and utilizing only a quarter of the power consumption, and providing up to 6 gigabits per second per rack. And now on slide 45, I want to point out that the final cost-saving feature that I will cover in this presentation, this is done with 1-to-N inter-beam redundancy for all active TX and RX cards within and across beams. See here the diagram that's trying to represent here the built-in chassis redundancy that supports exceptional density by having just one redundant card that can serve as backup for any malfunctioning card in the chassis. This example, also implemented in the X architecture, significantly saves on CapEx. We have now gone over the 5 points that summarize what is needed for the ground segment to maximize the HTS opportunity. So the 5 points are cloud-based distributed architecture, support for multiple markets, efficient bandwidth management, network scalability and flexibility, and reduced OpEx and CapEx. And we sincerely believe that these attributes, implemented properly, can make all the difference when planning for your satellite network's growth. You can see here the press release that Gilat recently issued, launching the X architecture for SkyEdge II-c. This architecture was designed to address the exciting opportunities that lay ahead with HTS, all from a single platform. The subtitle of the press release reads, and I'll read it to you, "The SDN-based architecture enables satellite operators to dynamically support applications and business models from a single platform." The launch took place at China Satellite last month, and then again just now at AfricaCom. It was very well received, and I'm also pleased to share with you that we already have commitments from major satellite operators in China as well as in Latin America, and quite a few more on the way. We will now go to the Q&A part of the presentation. I will take some of the questions that have been typed in, so just bear with me for just one moment, please. Note that we will answer to you personally questions that we don't get to during this session. Just 1 minute. Okay, here's the first question for NSR. How easy or difficult is the integration of the solution mix in terms of the space segment and the ground segment? Can you please take this, Mr. Del Rosario?
Sure, thank you, Ms. Oren. The news on the space segment often overlooks the importance of the ground segment, but they're equally important. Integration is not easy, and I'm sure Gilat can attest to this. If we take mobility, for instance, as outlined in an earlier example by Ms. Oren, an aircraft travels around, I guess, 600 miles per hour. It needs to maintain a broadband connection up and down at least 1 megabits per second per user, and then roam from one satellite provider to another doing this mid-flight. That's a lot of integration that satellite equipment needs to accomplish. So the short answer is it's not easy. And once again, picking the right solution will be key, a key decision for customers or systems integrators when choosing, to outfit a fleet of aircraft. It's one equipment for a fleet of 20 to 200, and choosing one integrated solution early will be key. And again, addressing the difficulty in terms of making sure the SLA and the connection is maintained while traveling at 600 miles per hour.
Thank you. I would like to add, as I mentioned earlier, that of course Gilat is fully prepared to handle this challenge with the X architecture. I'll take another question here. I'll answer this one. We've talked about GEO-HTS. What about O3B and LEO-HTS? Can X architecture support these programs? Okay, yes, surely. As for O3B, we are partnering with them and have a modem that's designed together with O3B. And as for LEO-HTS, we are in discussions with leading LEO-HTS operators for future collaboration, but I prefer not to get into this at this time. So please bear with me. And here is another question. What is the unique value proposition of the X architecture compared to other terminals available in the market today from Gilat's competitors? Well, I think I've kind of spoken about that for the last half hour. But I would say the different competitors are focusing on different areas. Our advantage is that we have a new architecture that uses a single platform with a global NMS, and it's been designed to also protect the past investments of wide-beam satellites and also to take you into the promise in the future of HTS. And I would say that we differentiate with several points, and let me just quickly review those points. The first is that we support both fixed and mobility applications. This is the consumer market, backhaul, enterprise, and also on-the-move application. And more than that, we have a full portfolio of VSATs that are fine-tuned for these specific needs, for these specific applications. Another key point that I want to make that differentiates us is that we've optimized for multi-spot beams, giving very high flexibility for business expansion in order to be able to easily add satellites and beams. And the third differentiator that I like to point out is our density. We deliver unprecedented density, as I mentioned, up to 6 gigabits per second per rack. And maybe the fourth differentiator is the most important, and that's being future ready with our distributed architecture that is with built-in SDN support. And it's already actually implemented with our cost-saving software-defined RF matrix. This is extremely important as the world is moving to cloud to have an architecture that is ready for this next step. Okay, let's see another question here for NSR. Just a second. Okay, if a customer wants to switch from one equipment provider to another, and the customer has a large installed base, wouldn't large CapEx already invested be a concern? Okay, please take this question, Mr. Del Rosario.
Thank you. Excellent question. I think, as we mentioned earlier, it boils down to costs. So we have to take a look at the total cost of ownership over the long term. Yes, over the short term, the ROI on investment will not make sense. But if you look at a long term, say a 5 to 10 year horizon, the TCO will make the shift an easy decision, quote unquote, due to the cost savings achieved. But you do have a point on the CapEx, and I will say it will be good to choose well and to choose early so you don't have to think about switching from one equipment provider to another. Ms. Oren pointed out that, for example, their solution is future ready. So the more future ready the solution is, the better. The satellite business is inherently long-term. Satellites are launched 10 to 15 years, so a business case has to be made within the next 10 to 15 years. And that's on the sky. That should apply on the ground as well. Your equipment should last without thinking of switching to another provider for at least 5, 10, 15-year horizon.
Okay, thank you. I see here a similar question, so I'll take a shot at this one. Technology is moving at a fast pace. What is the longevity of the X architecture? Will these be obsolete in a few years? Well, we are committed to our equipment for more than 10 years. That is why we consider it future-proof. And when looking at the TCO, there is no question that the X architecture is the right investment. X architecture was built for flexibility with the future in mind to let you scale your business. So there's no worries. On the contrary, if you're looking into the future, X architecture is exactly what you need. Okay, I'd like to now go back to the webinar just for the last slide in order to summarize. So now I'm on slide 49, the last slide in the webinar. We heard from Jose Del Rosario about the opportunity with GEO HTS and how it is indeed a game changer. And we heard about the opportunity in a variety of vertical markets. And then we introduced the challenge on the ground segment equipment. I then explained this challenge and how X architecture for SkyEdge II-c has been designed to overcome these challenges. So in summary, I would say that the X architecture, you can be confident with it is that you can achieve high flexibility and high scalability, the high density, the high availability, and high efficiency. And of course, all this with low CapEx and OpEx. And this is while supporting multiple markets and operational scenarios from a single platform. And I want to tell you that you can find more information on our website, www.gilat.com/xarchitecture. And I want to point out that we also have a 4-minute video that will summarize the points I went over. All this is also on our website. We invite you to contact us and hear more about how you can maximize your HTS opportunity with X architecture for SkyEdge II-c. And I'd like to conclude with that and urge you to keep in touch. We are here to hear you. And I would like to thank our guest speaker, Mr. Del Rosario from NSR. And of course, I would like to thank you all for attending. As I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded and it will be available shortly on our website. So enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are around the world. This concludes the webinar, and thanks very much for attending.